Similarly, at roughly the same time, a project Peter David and I did called the Atlantis Chronicles. As the editor there, I came to Peter and I said, let's tell a generational saga about Atlantis from the sinking to Aquaman. And Peter said, we basically had carte blanche, and we decided what kind of characters was going to be, which generations we wanted to focus on, and that got experimental because I got to bring in a Spanish artist who had a whole different, visual look to it all. DC supported me by putting it on better paper for reproduction purposes. We were able to double up the number of pages so that it was coming out as a 48-pager over 7 months instead of 22 pages over 12 months. So we definitely got to play around, and it just got collected after nearly 30 years. And it's holding up very nicely. It's an actual story. So as an editor, those are the two I point to.
So why do you think DC was so willing to, with the Aquaman one, why they seemed really invested in that one?
Well, largely because at the time DC was riding high. By 1986, it had introduced Frank Miller's Dark Knight, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen, and they recognized that if they gave creators a lot of leeway, really good things can come out of it. Now, it wasn't, anything goes. Partly, we still had to come out every 30 days. Partly, we couldn't do a lot of swearing and nudity and the like. This was not, something like Atlantis was not intended for mature audiences. So there were parameters, but they just let us go. I said I want to do a generational story about the sinking of Atlantis. They said sounds good, and that gave us the freedom because they had so many other successes. They said let's keep the ball rolling.
Did you have any ideas that DC, in this vein, that DC said maybe not?
There was none I was personally involved in. There was one that might have been a little bit ahead of its game called the Hacker Files. I had gone to publisher Paul Levitz and I said, I'm looking for something of mine that can have the same kind of reputation that Swamp Thing and Hellblazer had, and I'm just casting about. And he basically said to me, find something you're really interested in, you as the editor are invested in, and find some like-minded creators and see what you come up with. And I came up with a writer named Louis Shiner, who is a science fiction author, and with his writing partner Bob Wayne, who was a marketing guy at DC at the time. They were already writing this Rip Hunter Time Master miniseries for me called Time Masters. And Lewis was very much into computer software and programming, and he was on what was in the late 80s the cutting edge of where computers and the growing internet were, because this is just when the World Wide Web was being introduced. And people worrying about hackers already. So I turned to Lewis and I said, all right, you do software, you like comics. What can we do with this? We came with this thing about this hacker and government conspiracies and big business conspiracies. And it really was going to look at the dangers of this growing technology. But then I moved to a different role within DC, and the project was handed to a different editor who basically backburnered it for a year or two. And there was a period where that editor had left staff and there were these projects that needed to be finished out, and I basically said, look, I know I'm doing this administrative work, but let me finish this. This is my baby. I started it and I got to finish it, and it's a blip in the radar, and it never quite caught on the way it needed to because it was sort of one of those orphaned projects. So that was a near miss.
Okay. Would have been interesting to see. Okay. And as a writer, anything experimental that you've...
I'm not an experimental writer because I don't come at it with the same muse and inspiration that some of the guys I really admire come at. People who can come up with these amazing points of view and ways of looking at the world that are very different. I'm way too nuts and bolts a guy. I'm too much of a, I guess, type A or OCD personality to really be this free-flowing thinker. So I have my little area of writing that makes me comfortable, characters and ideas. And I don't get experimental in the wordsmithing or the world building. It's just not who I am. It's stuff I admire and I envy. I just know my limits.
Okay. So as far as when you know, like take this novel, this Captain America novel, how do you go through the process of crafting it? You know, how do you lay it out?
Okay, well, let's start with the fact that Marvel owns Captain America.
Right.
So I know I've got certain limitations what I can do with his character and the world he's in.
Right.
After that, I come up with an interesting story that I would be interested in writing, that I hope other people would be interested in reading. I would start off with a one-paragraph pitch to the editor. If they like it, they might ask for it to be tweaked a little or fleshed out into a one-page, slightly longer outline for Marvel to approve. And once Marvel's feedback came in, then I had to turn it into a chapter-by-chapter outline, which ran about 10 pages. Not very, very detailed. And I had all my characters, that we knew where we were setting each chapter, who the villains were, what was all the beats, all the key elements. What was it about? What was the problem? What were the conflicts that needed to be resolved? How am I raising the tension to build to a climax? And then how do I resolve it? Once the chapter-by-chapter outline was approved, I'd then be able to start writing. Now, while all that was happening, I did a deeper dive into the research on these characters in these Marvel fictitious countries I was setting my stories in, so that I could bring them to life and they would also resonate to comic book readers who would recognize Simcaria or Slovenia, wherever I set my story.
So at a more basic level, just talking about the interplay between dialogue and narration and detail, how do you approach that? Or is it just something instinctual?
No, it's not so much instinctual as in practice. Okay. Because I've written enough fiction for the last 30 years. I'm definitely more accustomed and comfortable with it, so I can just get started. And if it's a character like Captain America, I know his voice. I've read his comics since I was a kid. Characters I invented, it took a little longer to figure out how I wanted. I figured out what type of person they were, and then I figured out, if he's this kind of a person, and he's a senator, how would a senator from the West talk, right? So I gave some thought to that, and definitely I played around with dialogue when I realized people were starting to sound a little too similar, so I want a little more casual, a little more, someone else might be a little more formal, so that they do sound differently, and that they do bounce off each other. And some of that came through the actual first draft writing. Other times I would notice as I was going through the second pass, maybe I tweaked some of the dialogue here. I'd pick different words because it might somebody sounds maybe a little too sophisticated in the moment, using the wrong word. So there were tons of synonyms. I would just pick the right one for the right tone I'm going for that moment. Right.
So what inspires or informs the ideas you come up with?
Oh, that everywhere. I read the daily newspaper, I read news magazines, I read Smithsonian and Vanity Fair, and the World Wide Web has got millions of stuff that people post on Facebook pages or tweets. And based on what's going on there, things are always generating ideas. Yesterday during the writing workshop, Howard Weinstein was using a clip from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and as he was setting the clip to illustrate his point, he was providing some backstory for the audience who may have been less familiar. And as he was talking about this, he was applying it to Butch at this point when the real Butch Cassidy was alive, about photography actually being part of his undoing. And I suddenly had this moment of inspiration about something that could be done contemporary. I have this idea now. I have no idea what to do with it, but it's this idea that I'm now jotting down, and hopefully someday a story will present itself where I can actually use this idea. So you never know. It's a casual conversation. It's a news story. You see a TV episode and you go, no, that's not how it should end. It should be like this, and you run off with it, and it comes from everywhere.
So do you go, when you do research, are you the type to go down rabbit holes or do you stick to what you need to find out?
It varies. It depends. on the Star Trek or any science fiction stuff, I do enough scientific research into astronomy as needed, so that if I'm creating a planet around a red sun, I understand what a red sun might be and what the orbit, how much the orbit might be. And I bought a textbook that one of the shore leave organizers helped contribute to that just came out that looks like a great primer for me to work with, because I've been looking for a good primer, not just books on the solar system or books on stars or whatever. I do a lot of research. When I did my Sherlock Holmes novel, there I went down the rabbit hole as I kept exploring Victorian London, because I was like, oh, that's interesting. I'm looking up timetables from London to different parts of England, figuring out how long the train ride would be, and I'm going, oh, that's an interesting facet about this train station. So yes, you definitely can go down the rabbit hole, but then the trick is pulling yourself out of the rabbit hole and then using only what you need to make the chapter or story authentic, and not fall into the kitchen sink sharing every bit of research in your manuscript, which is not necessary, and just bloats the manuscript and slows down your story.
Right. Now, earlier you had mentioned, I think when I mentioned getting kids interested more in science.
Right.
You had, so was it your wife brought up
I'm a teacher, and I teach high school English.
Okay.
And I recognize the value of anyone interested in STEM material. Science, technology, math, engineering, and any of that. You have to be able to read this stuff to understand what the formula means. You got to read the stuff to understand where it came from, and you have to be able to figure out how you apply all of this stuff. And a lot of people go, "Well, I want to, be a biologist. I don't have to worry too much about literature." And it's like, not really, because you have to understand how to write a lab report to, be a clear writer. You have to understand the research you're reading for your lab work, and frankly, the history of any of these subjects can be so incredibly fascinating. And if you're not a good reader, you can get lost. So, there's a lot of valuable material. Students who want to be scientists or mathematicians or computer programmers, they do need the grounding in the basics.
So, back to your own writing, is there something special you need to do your writing, to be productive?
When I went to college, part of my undergraduate degree, the fancy title is General Literature and Rhetoric with a specialization in journalism. Part of that journalism is the newspaper comes out every Tuesday and Friday on campus. If we didn't have the finished newspaper edited, laid out, designed, and ready for the printer by sunrise, there was going to be no paper. I valued the need to be concise, to be efficient, to make my deadlines, and still leave the time to go do the interviews, transcribe the interviews, do the research, do the background, whatever. That informed everything I did as an editor at DC Comics and elsewhere, and then became a freelance writer and editor. The value of the schedule and the value of allocating the time each project requires, and everything requires different time and effort. An original novel that requires a lot more detailed background research might take a lot more time than a Captain America story, because Captain America already exists. I've read him all my life. I know, I'm a walking, talking guy. I can tell you anything you need to know. It's a lot different than when you're making it up.
Yeah. So with your schedule, with the milestones that you have, is there a sense of nervousness about reaching each one, or do you feel more comfortable knowing you've laid it out?
It all varies. I mean, like the Captain America book had such a long gestation period that when I finally got the contract, they said to me, all right, here it is, the February or March. Can we have it by the end of June? It's like, I got a day job, so it's that's a little tight. And we talked about it, and I said, all right, I can do this. And then I talked to my wife about it, and we looked at our schedule and what our family commitments were, and I made sure that the time was allocated for it. But you have to be realistic. You can't say to an editor, yes, I can make by June 30th, and you know in your heart there's no way you're going to do it. That hurts your professional reputation and impacts your ability to get the next job.
Right. So this is more of a philosophical question, but what role does, well, let me ask you this. I was going to ask, what role does the writer have, but what role does the editor have?
In any job, the editor is there to put out the best possible story. Is it the best possible novel? Is it the best possible comic book, short story collection, whatever? The editor has to make sure he has picked the right talent or has the right ideas with the writer. You know, quite often the writers, if it's an original idea, the editor has to have a feeling like, yes, I understand enough of the science or enough of the history, or these are interesting themes and characters. Yes, I can work with you. And they have to bring to it the ability to steer a writer. You know, you're going off the tracks here because you're getting into this wilderness of plot that we don't really need at the moment. You can save it for later, or maybe we don't need it at all, or characters might talk a little differently, or you might want to change the pacing here. So the editors are guides. The editors want to bring the best out of the writer, especially if it's an original work. If it's a licensed property, they have to protect the property. I can't have Captain America going out saying all these racist epithets or sleep around, because that's not who the character is, and the editor becomes the guardian of that licensed property.
So something that comes to mind, at least with entertainment, like Walt Disney said, I'd like to entertain and maybe educate a little bit.
Right.
You know, slip it in there, the teaching. Sure. So is that how you feel, as an editor of entertainment?
I would like to think there's something useful that people can get out of anything I work on, either as a writer or as an editor. When I grew up in comics, reading comics as a kid, I learned some basic chemistry and some basic physics from the use of the superheroes because there were editorial footnotes or house ads about this stuff. So I knew that FE stood for iron long before anybody else in my class, because that was Pharaoh Lad in the Legion of Superheroes. Yeah. So, yes, I try to imbue something useful, educational. In the Captain America novel, there was some discussion about the best way to make a particular European pastry. And there was a debate about, is it the buttermilk you use? Is it the baking? A Star Trek novel, I had a discussion about winemaking because Picard, came from a vineyard.
Right.
So, yeah, a little bit of educational stuff here and there can sneak in.
Yeah, but primary is entertain and keep them hooked.
Well, making a good story about characters, hopefully the readers get invested in.
So, what apart from your own works, is there anything in sci-fi or fantasy that has inspired you? Music, films, whatnot?
I listen to a lot of movie soundtracks when I write to help set the mood. And so, if it's a Star Trek novel, obviously there's a ton of Star Trek stuff, but thankfully there's enough movie and TV soundtrack material out there through the years that if I'm writing a Sherlock Holmes book, maybe I'm listening to stuff that's a lot more orchestral, more classical, because that's Holmes' era. So I pick and choose from that end. Every time I'm reading for myself, I'm always paying attention to how people do stuff, and the last couple of years, I was really paying attention to how Jim Butcher, in his Dresden novels, does his world building as well as his plotting, so that I realize that every now and then you reach a point in the story where we learn something and all of a sudden we realize the stakes are higher than we ever imagined, or there's this bit of world building. I didn't know that, and wow. So I'm trying to bring the same thing to what I'm working on. So it's a constant education.
Okay. Now back to your role as an educator. Do you feel? Actually, let me ask a different question. So, being an educator, do you think there's enough of an interest in science and engineering among kids?
Depends upon the kid. I mean, we've got a robotics club at our school that's very well attended. They love getting their hands on the building of these things and creating robots for competition, so they figure out the best and most elegant way to do that. We got a 3D printer as part of all of that, so the kids are getting really fascinated in what 3D printing is all about. But that captures their imagination, but it doesn't capture everyone's imagination.
Right.
We've got other science activities, other math activities. I know we want to do more with offering programming. So, there has to be something for the people who are not interested in athletics or theatrical or musical material. And that's every school's challenge, to make sure that there's something for every interest, so that no kid is lost between the cracks.
So do you think, apart from things you can do at school or even here at the conventions where they promote science, do you have any ideas as far as further outreach?
I want my kids in the high school where I teach, I want them to pay more attention to the world they're living in. I keep reading in the articles that this is the digital generation. They grew up with computers and the internet and all, and I recognize that they're really good at texting, they're really good at social media, and they're not so good on understanding what their laptops can do. I want them to be a little more curious about the tools that they use. I want a little more curious about what else can they do with it, and as well as the world they live in. They know about hip hop, they know about sports, but I make a lot of cracks about what's going on in the news, and I realize they're not paying that much attention. And these are college-bound kids for the most part. It's a scary world out there if you walk out of high school unprepared.
Yeah. So, and you said you teach which course again?
I teach American literature to sophomores and honors British literature to juniors.
Okay, so obviously critical thinking is important for a kid to develop that
Absolutely.
skill. Do you think, can it be better developed with sort of writing or science, or can you even say that?
Well, let's face it, when you're writing up your lab results, you have to be able to look at the numbers and go, all right, what's the story it's telling me, and how do I explain that in my lab report? How do I communicate this to the other people? And being able to compare, well, they did the same experiment and got this result, and I got this result. What critical thinking skills can I apply to understanding how the numbers might have varied, the results? There's a lot more kids could do. Just understanding, how did we get here? How did we get to this point in biology or chemistry or physics? How do we get from Newton to Neil deGrasse Tyson today, or the other physicists in the world? What were the building blocks? Who were the important people? They should understand the history of their field. And there are amazing stories.
Right.
I would love more women to know about Ada Lovelace. Not only is she Lord Byron's daughter, but she was one of the premier mathematicians and early thinkers about what computers were capable of.
Yeah. So this is a bit more whimsical question. When you were young, did you have a superpower or high-tech device that you wish you had?
My favorite DC character still remains Green Lantern. I want a power ring so badly.
Really?
I would love to be able to charge it up and for 24 hours be able to fly, be able to create things, avoid traffic, take care of problems. Power ring and be part of this intergalactic army of similar powered people always appealed to me.
Awesome. Now, is there something you'd love to write that you haven't done so yet?
International bestseller that is turned into a movie.
Oh, yeah?
Now, seriously, it's like I've had a number of ideas through the years that, for one reason or another, I've never managed to finish. And there are some I think would be really good stories. I need to find that spark again to get back to them and finish them and see what I can do with it. After I finish the current 3-book project I'm working on, hopefully, again, review the older material and go, this is the one I really want to get back to. And, bring that to fruition. I would love to be able to finish something.
Okay. So, where can people find your stuff online on the web?
Well, obviously, everything I do is at Amazon. I have an Amazon authors page. I've got a complete bibliography at my website, www.bobgreenberger.com. My Twitter handle is Bob Greenberger. I'm on Facebook. I'm available.
Okay, you're out there.
People can find me.
So, any final thoughts or words?
There is so much available to interest people who like numbers, who like chemicals, who like the stars, who like stories, that I hope people can push themselves a little and explore. Scratch that itch and be curious.
Yeah, just go for it. All right, well, thank you for speaking with me.
My pleasure.
If you like this podcast, please support me by following me on Instagram at Chris Alvarez Sci-Fi, on Facebook under Chris Alvarez WLC, and on my YouTube channel, which is also Chris Alvarez WLC. You've probably heard the podcast through iTunes, but if you haven't, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher by searching for the name Creating Sci-Fi and Fantasy, an Inside Look. And remember that my name has no H. It's CRIS. Thank you, and keep imagining the future.